I didn't really understand the importance of color contrast until I was working on a project for Wells Fargo, and their brand team were pretty big sticklers about asking if the colors that I used in the designs were passing AA accessibility. So I had to kind of ramp up pretty quickly and do a little bit of research. Found some color checkers online where you can plug in your foreground color, plug in your background color, and then it spits out whether or not that particular combination would pass AA or not. And there are a range of scores, but their particular bare minimum was AA. So ever since this project, I've kind of learned the importance of testing color contrast. So the Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines cover a ton of things that are not necessarily all related to color contrast, but this particular topic inside of that document is one of the most applicable things that we as designers can start using inside of our designs on static screens to make them more accessible. So they use an equation to determine the contrast between two different colors. So the equation spits out scores of 1 to 21, 1 being, black on black, the exact same color with a score of 1, and 21 would be like black on white, as much contrast as you could possibly ever have. No contrast, could go higher. That is a 21 score. And so inside of there are the ranges of accessibility. Before I dig all inside of those scores, sometimes it's helpful to just understand why those scores were created in the first place. So there's empirical evidence that states that someone with perfect 20/20 vision can see and perceive color contrast at a score of 3.0. So that's where the AA large score comes in, and it is kind of like the absolute minimum contrast for readable text. Now again, these scores don't necessarily apply to decorative elements and logos and things like that, but it's definitely not bad to consider when you're designing. And there's also evidence that states that someone with 20/40 vision has a sensitivity loss of 1.5. And that just means that, a black on white kind of text would look a little fuzzier because of their visual impairment. And so that's where the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they take that 1.5 and they add it to the 3.0, and that's how they come up with the AA scores. So this is specifically for people with 20/40 vision. That's where they have to derive that particular score. And then going even further, someone with 20/80 vision, and this is technically someone who is legally blind with 20/80 vision. This is really bad vision. And most of the time, people with 20/80 vision, their vision cannot be corrected with lenses. So this is really, really bad vision. That's where the AAA score comes from. Now, you don't really have to remember all the different vision things, and you don't really have to, there's only a few little things that if you as a designer can remember and you can look for when you're picking colors, you're going to be set. So we have our range of scores here, and 1.5 score, which is just above a 1, which would be full black on black. So this 1.5 score is definitely failing. This is a hex code 2C on full black that produces a score of 1.5. This is kind of danger zone here. You don't want to make any text that fails, specifically when you're trying to design a usable interface component. All right, so just one step up from here, you're gonna have AA large. And I usually use a plus sign to kind of abbreviate large, but this is a 3.0 score. So if you do a 666666 hex code on black background, then you get a 3.0 score. A lot of different colors are going to produce different scores. I'm just using grayscale for simplicity's sake. This is like your bare minimum level of passing score. Now with the 3.0 score, there are font size requirements, and the WCAG states that it should be a 14-point bold or 18-point regular. And this roughly translates into 18.5 pixels bold or 24 pixels regular if you're just designing for a mobile screen at 1x. And the reason that it's an approximation is because there's a lot of different fonts are wider and narrower by default. There's not like a gold standard of weight. So they're kind of suggestions. It's not like to the letter of the law, but it is, you need to err on the side of passing versus failing. So that's the 3.0 score. It does have size requirements. Now, the AA score right here in the middle, that's going to be your sweet spot. This is going to cover everyone with 20/40 vision. And a lot of these people are going to be wearing corrective lenses, contacts, glasses. But if they aren't, they can still read your interface. So this is like 7.5, 7.5, 7.5 on a black background. And this is actually pretty similar with a white background. This 7.5 hex code, if you can remember 7.5, 7.5, 7.5, it's going to work well for black or full white backgrounds. This is kind of like your gold standard for minimum passing like body copy text or titles. Technically, you could go lighter than this with titles, but it would start to kind of be in the danger zone, but you know, it's a safe sweet spot. So if you can hit 4.5, you're going to be sitting pretty good, and you can lower and increase the contrast depending on the other interface, you know, decisions that you're making. So AAA, this is going to be your 7.0 contrast score. So really anything from 7.0 to 21 is all going to be in the AAA range. This is kind of the highest level of color contrast accessibility. And for the most part, most of your kind of standard title and body copy are gonna look the best at 7.0. There's maybe some rare occasion where it looks better to do 4.5 for maybe some slight stylistic, maybe a little smaller callouts or smaller UI components, especially when you get into like metadata and secondary data. But if you're just going with a title and a body copy, like for a long blog post, 7.0 is going to be a pretty good contrast score for how dark the text should be on a white background. Sometimes if you go all the way to 4.5, it can feel, even though it passes AA score, it can just feel like it's too light, and reading that for a long amount of time might start to strain someone's eyes. So I like to try to hit a 7.0 for titles and body copy. And then like I said, 7 from 21, it's all AAA. But a few caveats here. To actually hit a AAA score according to the Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines, you also have to provide controls that allow a user to change the background and foreground color. So even though your text color might hit that AAA score, your website or your app as a whole might not actually hit the AAA score because it might not be providing those controls. And that's kind of why I like to say that AA is the sweet spot, because there's not a ton of extra requirements on that particular score. So while 7.0 is a good score, you know, you're not going to hit AAA for your entire app without hitting a number of other requirements. And I implore you to look deeper into the content accessibility guidelines for more information on all of that. All right, so let's talk about ways to check your actual color contrast scores. So let's say I'm laying out this registration header here, and I want to check, I wonder what this burgundy is on this white background. Well, a long time ago, I would have to go in here. So if this is a symbol, so I got to go into that. All right, so I've got my color here. So I would copy this, and then I would go to this website called Colorable by a guy named Brent Jackson. It's colorable.jacksonblack.com. And then I would paste in here my burgundy, and then I know my background was white. And I could see, hey, this is AAA score. It's got a score of 7.96. It's above 7.0. It's AAA, so I know for a fact this passes. And that's what I would do for all of my individual pieces of text. I would look at the inputs, the labels, the titles, every single thing that I wanted to check, I would copy and paste into the website to check the scores. And as you can imagine, this gets a little bit cumbersome and kind of annoying to have to keep switching from design tool to browser. So that's why I created this little contrast checker called Contrast. And it's this little Mac app that pulls off the title bar, and then you can just use these eyedroppers. It is a little bit sensitive to color spaces, so it might not always be 100% to the T accurate every time you use a color dropper, because it kind of depends on if you're using like P3 color space or RGB color space, different things like that. But it will get you pretty close, and if you want, you can always just paste in your hex code into this thing as well. So I basically, anytime I'm designing any project, I will start off with kind of determining the baseline for what is my 3.0 large body copy color contrast swatch. And then I'll determine my AAA and my AA and just kind of work from there. I want to know, like, what is my absolutely do not go lighter than this, my sweet spot, and then like a really good higher contrast for text and body copy. If I can get those 3 color swatches kind of in my brain for the project, then that just kind of gives a really good foundation for adjusting and modifying colors. Now, I do want to emphasize again, this does not apply to borders and backgrounds and button backgrounds and input field backgrounds, or the borders rather. It only applies to the background color on the text. So anything that you need to read, which is most things, but you don't have to have every little tiny use of color past these scores. It's just for readable text. And there's also been a lot of times where I've had a client or an app that I was redesigning and they had maybe an existing color palette. And I would look at their color palette and I would say, oh, you know what? This kind of tan beige color that you're using for a lot of your secondary copy, this is actually failing contrast scores. So if you use something like this particular website, you can play around with the lightness and the darkness. So if you have something that's failing and you want to just kind of bump it up a bit, these sliders can be quite helpful to slightly adjust the score. And then similarly with contrast, if you have a score that is failing, just go up here. So you can see this is AA large. And if I went a little lighter, I can use my arrow keys to just nudge the score to be a little bit darker. And I can see where does it start to, so right in here is AA large and AA. So if I had the option of going with something that was AA large right in this range, you might as well go up to 4.5 and have just a nice AA score. Again, that's the sweet spot. 4.5 is going to be your sweet spot score. All the little different pieces of text are, they kind of need to pass that 4.5 to really just be accessible. And when you're reading these, when you're using an app over and over and over, it might look cool on your design program to make it light gray, as light as possible. And I'm so guilty of that. I did that in the past all the time, but it just gets hard to read. And so instead of just guessing, now we have actual scores we can just use and adhere to make sure that our text is readable. Now, there are a few gotcha situations, and those are like bright brand colors for primary calls to action. For example, even if you look at this Switch to Studio website, so Envision's color, when I was designing this, a lot of their calls to action are the pink color. And so if you look at this and you test this background, which is actually more of it's F3366, and then you have your white text. So you can see this is only a 3.5 contrast score. And this is definitely not 18 and a half pixel bold font. This is more like 14, 13 point bold font. So technically I'm skirting the contrast scores here by only going AA large. I'm like right in between AA large and AA. So this is one of the rare occasions where I will bend the rules a little bit because I want to be on brand. And if you start making this pink color a lot darker, then it starts to look off brand. And so in my personal opinion, for primary calls to action that are huge blocks of color, I think it's sometimes okay to go with a AA large instead of a 4.5. Another thing that I could have done here though is if you look at these little tags, the same exact background color with black text is actually a 5.92 score, which is plenty above AA. Actually a little closer to AAA score of 7 than it is of the bare minimum 4.5. So I could have gone with the black. And maybe in retrospect, maybe I should have done that. And it's definitely something that you should consider. If it's close and the white on the background just matches and it's great and it's close to passing, I tend to bend the rules a little bit in these specific instances with the primary calls to action. but you're never going to go wrong with making sure you just have a tried and true passing AA score. So I'll leave that up to you to decide for your own projects. I just want to be clear with what I've done from time to time on mine. Another slight little gotcha could be these. For example, if you look back at this particular app, this is a registration field this is a registration form that has a deactivated save button. And this only activates whenever you have completed enough input fields. It will turn that same red and same, contrast that we have on the cancel button. That will show up once you have the amount of information that's required. But, if you check the score, let's see, we have a CB, that's a super light color, super light gray. So let me pull this off. So this is a 1.69 contrast. So I know for a fact that making this into the 7s is gonna put it more at a AA, and it's really like in the 9s right here is gonna be closer to a AA large. If I went a little bit darker, actually I can just hit down in my contrast tab here. So I'm gonna copy this hex code right here and paste this in. So if we look at that compared to the cancel, right now this is a AA large passing save button. This is not 18.5 bold, but it is 17 medium, which is close. These are approximations. But if we look at this now like that, it's kind of save is like a nice contrast now. I can read it, but it's technically deactivated. And right now it could possibly be considered active. So this is another little kind of a gray area where for deactivated buttons, I tend to try to go as low as possible on the contrast scale, like 3.0. Sometimes I will dip into the fail contrast score of like 2.5 because I don't want anyone to be confused that they can actually tap on that button and use it. So this is a little bit of a gray area because if you go too low, then there's a chance that someone might not be able to read it at all. But there is also, you could make a case for if a button is deactivated that it's completely gone. And there's no rule that you can't take away a button from a user. There's no accessibility rule about that, although it might be kind of a bad practice. But this is kind of one of those gray areas. This is where I will, even if I'm using 16 pixel font and I'm doing like a 2.9 or 3.0 contrast for a deactivated button, sometimes I will do that because I want it to be clear that this is deactive. But again, if we think about the scores, think about someone with 2080 vision for a AAA score. More than likely, those types of people are going to use a screen reader or have other devices that help them with the code that read the actual text to them because their vision can't be corrected with glasses. And then the people who are in the 2040 range, to hit those AA scores, some of them, maybe not all, are going to be wearing corrective lenses, ideally to get them to a 20/20 vision with their glasses on. And so according to all of the contrast scores, people with 20/20 vision can read 3.0 fine. And I have 20/20 vision, and if I reduce the color of this particular save button below 3.0, I can still read that. I know that there are a lot of people that can't read that. And so this is the gray area. You kind of have to be careful with this. This is where you have to decide, is my action color strong enough to offset the color of my deactive button? So if I left this button at a 3.0 contrast, which is still actually not quite passing because it's not that large size font, Even this at 3.0, at this size, 17 points, this is not passing AA. So in order to pass AA, we'd have to make this more like 7.5, 7.5. But then this just looks like a black or a gray title. So again, gray area. Sometimes I will bring it down to 3.0 or lower for deactive properties. I'm not going to say to do that because it could be that I'm wrong in doing that. But also, if you look at a lot of apps that Apple is producing, they will also use a score that is pretty low, if not failing, for some of their deactivated buttons. So in my mind, a deactivated button is almost the same as an invisible button. So people with good enough eyesight to see that it's deactive, it's almost like an enhancement. And maybe for people who can't read it at all, it's okay because once it's active, it'll go psh, and then that's when you want to hit the 4.5 or the 7.0 contrast for everyone to be able to see what action they can take. So I view this as almost like progressive enhancement instead of, designing all of my interface at a very low contrast score that only people with perfect 20/20 vision can see. So again, gray area, I just needed to get all of that out there because this is something that you will encounter from time to time. You may also be tempted to put legal copy, like in underneath, privacy terms. You may be tempted to make that super light gray where you can barely read it, but that, you don't want to make it 21, like full black on full white, because sometimes it just seems too overpowering. So you kind of want to play with the AAA score, the AA score, and maybe sometimes I've also done like a 3.0 for legal copy, or maybe 4.5 when it's smaller. So if you hit 4.5, you can play with placement and size versus like really, really bringing down the color contrast, because you don't want to be deceptive. You want people to be able to read your actual copy. And so if you use color for something like legal copy, it ends up being kind of unethical to make it completely gray and not passing contrast. So I would recommend hitting 4.5 and just playing with size and position. And you can kind of get out of, that whole ethical gray area, because plain and simple, if it's important and required to be there by law, it needs to be able to be read, and you don't want to deceive anyone. So you have to kind of balance the color contrast with placement, negative space, things like that, more than just sucking all of the color out of your elements. I'm hoping that you can start to use one of these methods of color choosing as a kind of like your new go-to method for when you're designing your UI components. So the three methods that I would recommend are this Colorable website, which is free for anyone to use. You can copy and paste your hex codes into here, no problem. Or you can go to the Mac App Store and pick up Contrast. This is the app that I designed, and it's the one that I use all the time. Another option is to go to Use Contrast, but with a .st on the end. Use Contrast, use your hex codes like 777/000. So this is going to be like a URL checker. So any hex code formatted in a 3-digit or a 6-digit hex code. So any 3-digit or 6-digit hex code, foreground/background on this URL, you can check any of these colors. So you've got your failing color here. We've got our 666 on 000 for AA large. Got our 77 on black for AA. And you can see we've got our 9900. And again, you can use any combination. So this would be like red on black. You can reverse them out by reversing those in the URL. So it's kind of a handy way to check your colors and share the URL like inside of a design system documentation, or post it online or send it to a colleague. And you can also grab any of the scores out of the Contrast app by just hitting copy URL, and that will automatically paste in the scores that you have inside of the app. And then finally, there's an app called Stark that is available as a plugin inside of Sketch, Figma, and Adobe XD. This will allow you to get in here and select 2 different color objects. So for example, if I have a black square here, So if I want to check this color, which is 6.6 on this black square, and then I go plugins, Stark, check contrast, it will automatically spit out the combination right inside of your design tool. So this one is passing AA large text, but it is failing for normal text and failing for AAA, which is fine because, you know, this is the score we wanted. It works similarly in Sketch and XD. You just select 2 layers and run the contrast checker and it spits out your score. So whatever method you end up using, whether it's websites or a built-in app or the Mac app, please just start using this as a part of your process, because it's gonna make your designs that much more accessible, and it's just gonna be, you know, better overall for everyone. Okay, so for homework, I want you to choose and explore one of the color contrast checking mechanisms. Contrast, Stark, Colorable, or any other ones that you might happen to find. Just start experimenting with them and see which one you like best. You know, I personally use mine because it's what I wanted, but you're totally welcome to use any color picker that you want to use, but start playing around with those. That way you just kind of have something as a go-to tool to start using to check your colors. Secondly, go to usecontrast.com/guide, and I have written a pretty exhaustive kind of what the scores mean and what they are, and covering a lot of the content. So just to familiarize yourself a little bit more with what the color contrast scores mean. So you don't really have to produce any particular designs, but just start to just kind of get your go-to tool and do a little bit of further reading about this. And we'll kind of use this as a foundation for picking any and every color that we use in our interfaces from now on.